The bells above the heavy glass doors of the gold and silver pawn shop chimed with a familiar, metallic ring, but the man who stepped inside didn't look like the usual Vegas tourist looking for a bargain. He moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle, his frame enveloped in a long midnight black trench coat that seemed to absorb the neon glare of the strip outside. Thick, round-tinted glasses obscured his eyes, and a mass of dark, wild hair spilled over his collar. To the tourists browsing, the rows of jewelry and vintage coins, he was just another eccentric character wandering in from the heat. To the staff behind the counter, he was a looky-loo, someone with a lot of curiosity and very little capital. Rick stood behind the main counter, finishing a paperwork trail on a silver dollar when he noticed the stranger. The man wasn't looking at the guitars or the common memorabilia. Instead, he had wandered toward the back of the shop, past the velvet ropes, toward the high-security vault display. This was where the items with six-figure price tags lived, the artifacts that required a private appointment and a bank statement, just a glimpse. The stranger stopped in front of a reinforced glass case. Inside sat a pristine Victorian-era ceremonial blade, encrusted with deep red rubies and etched with occult symbols. It was a piece of history that had been valued by 3 separate experts as priceless, with a shop price tag that could buy a mansion in the hills. "Can I help you with something?" "More in your price range, sir?" a junior manager asked, his voice dripping with a polite but firm condescension. He didn't look up from his ledger, assuming the man was simply daydreaming. The stranger didn't flinch. He pointed a ring-clad finger at the ruby-hilted blade. His voice was a low, gravelly mumble that sounded like stones grinding together in a silk bag. "The blade. I want to see the blade." The manager finally looked up, eyeing the man's frayed coat and the way he leaned slightly on the counter. He shared a smirk with a security guard standing nearby. "Sir, that piece is for serious collectors only. It's not a souvenir." "That's a $250,000 item. Maybe you'd like to see the silver rings over by the entrance? They're much more manageable." The man in black didn't move. He just stared through those dark lenses at the treasure behind the glass, while the shop staff prepared to usher him back to the street, completely unaware that the eccentric in front of them had sold over 100 million records. The manager, a man named Miller who prided himself on sniffing out a buyer, stepped closer to the glass case, his posture stiff and protective. He didn't see a rock god. He saw a tourist in a dusty coat who was taking up valuable floor space. He tapped the reinforced glass with a polished fingernail, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet corners of the high-end section. "This," Miller began, shifting into his rehearsed, expert tone, "is the 17th century sovereign's dagger. It was commissioned by a secret society in Eastern Europe and features hand-cut Burmese rubies. It's not just jewelry, it's a historical artifact of the occult." He paused, waiting for the man in the tinted glasses to look intimidated. "The price is $250,000. Firm. No haggling, no layaway, and certainly no trying it on for a photo." The stranger leaned in closer, his nose nearly touching the glass. To Miller's annoyance, the man didn't seem impressed by the price tag. Instead, he seemed mesmerized by the craftsmanship. "The balance," the stranger mumbled, his voice thick and raspy. "Is it top-heavy? The hilt looks weighted for a ceremony, not a strike." Miller rolled his eyes, glancing at the security guard. "It doesn't matter if it's top-heavy, sir. It's a museum piece. It's meant to sit in a velvet-lined case in a climate-controlled room owned by someone with a very large bank account. It's the kind of item people spend 10 years saving for, only to realize they're still short by half." The stranger finally straightened up, turning his head slowly toward Miller. The overhead lights caught the edge of his purple-tinted lenses, but his eyes remained a mystery. "I've seen one of these before," he whispered. "In a manor in England. The steel was darker, This one this one has soul. Right, sure. Everyone's an expert in Vegas, Miller snapped, his patience finally snapping. He gestured vaguely toward the front of the store, where the bright lights of the $50 souvenir section hummed. Look, I've got a group of serious collectors coming in from Dubai in 20 minutes. I can't have the primary display blocked. If you're looking for something gothic or cool, we have some very nice stainless steel replicas near the door. They're $30, they look great on a bookshelf, and they won't require a mortgage. The stranger didn't move. He kept his gloved hands shoved deep into his trench coat pockets. The shop's atmosphere began to shift. The casual banter of the tourists in the front faded, leaving a heavy, awkward silence in the back vault. I didn't ask for a replica, the man said, his voice gaining a slight, sharp edge. I asked to see the blade. Open the case. Miller let out a short, dry laugh. Open the case? Sir, I don't open this case for anyone who doesn't have a black Amex or a letter of credit from a major bank. You're wearing a coat that looks like it's seen 3 decades of rain. You want to see the blade? Check our website. The high-res photos are free. The manager turned his back, signaling the end of the conversation. He was certain the man would shuffle away, defeated by the cold reality of the price tag. He had no idea he had just insulted a man who could buy the entire shop, and the block it sat on with a single royalty check. Miller didn't just stop at a refusal. He decided to make an example of the situation. The gold and silver pawn shop was often crowded, and a small circle of tourists had begun to linger, sensing the friction. They watched as Miller stepped from behind the high-security counter and walked toward a spinning rack of clearance items near the middle of the floor. Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk, Miller lied, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. I just know a mismatch when I see one. You're interested in dark things, right? The occult? The rock and roll aesthetic? He reached into a dusty bin of miscellaneous trade-ins and pulled out a jagged, stainless steel letter opener shaped like a dragon's wing. It was cheap, mass-produced, and the rubies in the eyes were clearly plastic. He held it out toward the man in the black coat. This is more your speed. It's $29. It's got that Prince of Darkness look you're going for. And the best part is, if you drop it on the sidewalk, you aren't out $250,000. It's practical, it's manageable, it fits the you budget I suspect we're working with here. The security guard chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that felt like a slap in the face. The stranger didn't reach for the plastic jeweled trinket. He didn't even look at it. He kept his gaze fixed on the vault, his hands still buried in the pockets of his worn trench coat. You think I'm playing dress-up, the stranger said. It wasn't a question. The rasp in his voice had grown colder, more focused. I think you're a fan, Miller countered, leaning against a display of vintage watches. And look, fans are great. Fans buy the tie shirts, they buy the cheap replicas, and they keep the lights on. But they don't buy 17th century ceremonial daggers. That's for the guys who own the stadiums, not the guys sitting in the back row. Now I've got a business to run. If you aren't buying the dragon wing, I'm going to have to ask you to move along to the gift shop. They have some lovely magnets near the exit. The insult was calculated. It was designed to make the stranger feel small, to remind him of his place in the social hierarchy of the shop. To Miller, this man was a type, an aging rocker who never quite made it, clinging to a wardrobe from 1985 and dreaming of treasures he could never possess. But the stranger remained remarkably calm. He didn't shout. He didn't demand to speak to the owner. He simply turned his head slightly, looking at the security guard, then back to Miller. You make a lot of assumptions based on a coat, the stranger remarked. I make assumptions based on 20 years in this trade, Miller shot back. I've seen real money walk through those doors. Real money wears Italian silk and carries a briefcase. Real money doesn't mumble about soul while staring at a $250,000 blade. Now are we done here? Or do I need to have my friend here show you the way to the sidewalk? The security guard took a half step forward, his hand resting near his belt. The tourists in the shop went silent, the air thick with the kind of tension that usually preceded a viral freakout video. They waited for the man in the black coat to snap, to curse, or to leave in a fit of embarrassment. Instead, the stranger let out a soft, dry chuckle. It was a sound of genuine amusement, as if he were watching a very small dog bark at a thunderstorm. "You're right about one thing," the stranger said, finally pulling one hand out of his pocket. He wasn't reaching for a weapon or a wallet. He pulled out a sleek black smartphone, an unreleased model that wouldn't hit the market for another 3 months. "I don't have a briefcase. I find them terribly heavy." He began to dial a number, his fingers moving with a surprising, practiced grace. "Whatever, buddy. Call your wife, call your bus driver, I don't care," Miller said, turning away to reorganize. "A tray of rings. Just do it outside. We aren't a phone booth." The stranger ignored him. He held the phone to his ear, his eyes still hidden behind the purple tint of his glasses. When the person on the other end picked up, he spoke only 4 words. "The blade." "Buy it." Miller didn't even look back. He was already adjusting a display of vintage Zippo lighters, the click-clack of the metal lids providing a rhythmic punctuation to his dismissal. "I told you, no more calls inside," Miller said, his voice flat. "And I don't care who you're talking to. Unless that's a direct line to the Federal Reserve, you're wasting your breath." The stranger lowered the phone, the screen still glowing with an active call. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked weary, like a man who had dealt with this specific brand of bureaucratic arrogance 1,000 times before. "I'm not calling my wife," the man said quietly. "I'm calling my accountant. He's going to need the wire instructions for the $250,000. At the mention of a wire transfer, a few tourists whispered. It was a bold claim for a man who looked like he'd spent the last week sleeping in a tour bus. Miller, however, just let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh. He turned around, leaning his elbows on the glass counter, staring directly at the man's tinted lenses. "A wire transfer? Buddy, do you know how many people come in here claiming they've got money on the way? We get princes from OZZY'S and tech moguls in flip-flops every single day. But here's the reality. That case stays locked until the money is in our account, cleared by our bank and verified by our owner. And since I'm the one who decides who gets those instructions, I'm telling you right now, the answer is no." The security guard, a hulking man named Big Sal, moved into the stranger's peripheral vision. He didn't touch him, but the message was clear. The conversation was over. "You heard the boss," Sal grunted. "Time to go." "Wait," the stranger said, his voice suddenly shifting. The mumble was gone, replaced by a strange melodic clarity. "You said you only opened the case for serious collectors. Define serious. Is it the suit? Is it the car out front? Or is it the ability to appreciate the history of the steel?" Miller sighed, exasperated. "Serious means you don't blink at the price. Serious means you don't look like you're about to ask me for a spare cigarette. Look at you. You're shaking, you're mumbling, and you're wearing a coat that belongs in a museum's 1970s grunge exhibit. You aren't a collector. You're a fan who's had a long night on the strip. Now, for the last time, get out before I have Sal help you." The stranger took a slow breath. He looked down at his hands, which were indeed trembling slightly, a telltale sign that any fan of rock history would have recognized instantly. But to Miller, it was just a sign of age or infirmity. "I've spent 40 years being told where I can and can't go," the stranger remarked, almost to himself. "Usually, it's because I've caused a bit of a row. This is the first time it's been because I wanted to buy a bloody knife." "It's a ceremonial dagger," Miller corrected snidely. And it's a dagger you will never touch. Not today, not tomorrow. Even if you won the Powerball tonight, I wouldn't sell it to you. I don't like your attitude, and I don't like people wasting my time with accountant fantasies. We're done, Sal? Big Sal reached out, his hand hovering near the stranger's shoulder. The crowd of onlookers held their breath. This was the moment of the firm no, the point where the protagonist is cast out into the cold. Seemingly defeated by the gatekeepers of the elite, the stranger didn't resist. He began to turn toward the exit, his head bowed. For a moment, it looked like Miller had won. The Prince of Darkness was being escorted out of a pawn shop, like a common trespasser. But as he reached the heavy glass doors, the shop's landline behind the counter began to ring. It wasn't the usual high-pitched chirp of a customer inquiry. It was the low, steady pulse of the owner's line, a phone that only rang when Rick, Corey, or the big boss himself were calling from the back offices. Miller frowned, his hand freezing on a tray of jewelry. He picked up the receiver. Gold and Silver, Miller speaking. The voice on the other end wasn't the owner. It was the shop's head of finance, and he sounded like he'd just seen a ghost. Miller, don't hang up. Tell me. Is there a man in a black coat in the vault right now? Miller glanced toward the door, where the stranger was just inches away from the sidewalk. Yeah, I'm just kicking him out. Why? Don't you dare touch him, the voice hissed. A wire just hit our holding account. $250,000. The sender's name, Miller, you idiot. The sender is Osborne. The silence that followed the voice on the other end of the line was deafening. Miller felt the blood drain from his face so quickly he felt lightheaded. He looked at the receiver in his hand as if it were a live grenade. Then slowly, mechanically, his gaze drifted toward the heavy glass doors. The stranger had stopped. He hadn't left yet. He was standing perfectly still, his hand resting on the brass handle of the exit, his back to the entire shop. He looked small, almost fragile, in that oversized coat, until you realized the sheer gravity of the moment. Big Sal, the security guard, was still mid-stride, his hand outstretched to guide the man out, but he froze when he saw the expression on Miller's face. Miller? Sal asked, his voice cracking with confusion. We tossing him or what? Miller didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt like it had been filled with dry sand. He looked down at the computer monitor on the counter, where a notification was blinking in a sharp, urgent green. Wire transfer confirmed. The amount was exact. $250,000.00. The originating account wasn't a local bank. It was a high-tier private wealth management firm based out of London and Los Angeles. The scruffy tourist hadn't been bluffing. He hadn't even been arguing. He had simply performed a financial surgical strike while being insulted to his face. Slowly, the man in the black coat turned around. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't have a smug "I told you so" grin. He just looked ... tired. He pushed his purple-tinted glasses up, the bridge of his nose with a trembling finger, the same tremor Miller had mocked just moments ago. Now looking at that hand, Miller didn't see infirmity. He saw the hands of a man who had gripped a microphone for 50 years, a man who had survived things that would have killed 100 ordinary people. Is there a problem with the signal? The stranger asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence of the shop. My guy says the tea is in the pot. Quotes Miller stammered, his voice jumping an octave. He dropped the phone receiver, and it dangled by its cord, hitting the side of the desk with a rhythmic thud-thud-thud. Mr. Osborne. The name rippled through the shop like a physical wave. The tourists who had been smirking suddenly gasped, fumbling for their phones to record. The eccentric wasn't a nobody. He was the godfather of metal, the Prince of Darkness. A man whose voice defined an entire genre of music. Ozzy Osbourne took a slow, shuffling step back toward the vault. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked directly at the ruby-encrusted dagger behind the glass. "The blade," Ozzy repeated, his voice soft but unwavering. "I'd like to see if it's top-heavy now. If that's all right." "With you," Miller scrambled. He fumbled with the keys at his waist, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the heavy brass ring twice. The metallic clatter on the floor felt like a gunshot in the hushed room. He was sweating now, a fine sheen of cold perspiration breaking out on his forehead. "Of course, yes, sir. I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea. We get so many people who—" Miller was babbling, his professional facade completely shattered. He finally found the high-security key and shoved it into the lock of the display case. The glass slid open with a smooth, expensive hiss. Ozzy didn't reach for it immediately. He stood there for a moment, smelling the air of the case, the scent of old velvet and cold steel. Then, with a surprisingly steady movement, he reached out and lifted the 17th-century weapon. The shop held its breath. The Pawn Star's staff. The tourists and the security guards watched as the rock legend turned, the $250,000 artifact over in his hands. He felt the weight of the rubies. He traced the occult engravings with his thumb. "It's not top-heavy," Ozzy whispered, a small, genuine smile flickering at the corners of his mouth. "It's perfectly balanced, like a soul in the dark." He looked up at Miller, who was standing there like a statue of regret. Ozzy didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology. He just stood there with the $250,000 blade in his hand, the ultimate silent response to a man who thought he knew everything about value. The tension in the shop had shifted from hostile to reverent in a heartbeat. The tourists who had previously backed away to avoid a scene were now pressing inward, their smartphone cameras glowing like a sea of digital fireflies. But the real spectacle wasn't just the celebrity, it was the arrival of the cavalry. As Ozzy stood there, balanced perfectly with the ancient blade in his hand, the heavy front doors of the gold and silver pawn shop swung open again. This time, it wasn't a lone wanderer. Two men in charcoal gray suits, wearing earpieces and moving with the synchronized precision of a security detail, stepped inside. They didn't look at the shelves of vintage toys or the rows of gold coins. They walked straight to the back vault, flanking the man in the black trench coat. One of the men carried a slender metallic briefcase. He didn't say a word to Miller. He simply nodded to Ozzy. "The transport is ready, sir," the man said, his voice a crisp contrast to the chaotic energy of the shop. "And the insurance rider has been updated for the transit." Miller, still hovering near the open glass case, felt like he was watching a high-stakes heist movie in reverse. This wasn't just a purchase. It was a logistics operation. He realized then that the shuffling man he'd tried to kick out was the center of a massive, professional ecosystem. "Wait!" A voice boomed from the elevated platform near the back offices. Rick Harrison himself stepped down the stairs, his face a mask of disbelief and immediate damage control. He'd clearly been alerted by the finance department. He bypassed Miller, giving him a look that promised a very long, very unpleasant performance review later, and walked straight toward the legend. "Ozzy," Rick said, extending a hand, his trademark laugh sounding a bit strained. "I am incredibly sorry about the you misunderstanding at the counter. We get a lot of characters in here, but that's no excuse. If I'd known you were coming, I would have had the private room ready." Ozzy didn't take the hand immediately. He was still looking at the dagger. "It's a fine shop you have here, Rick," Ozzy said, his gravelly voice echoing in the hush. "But your gatekeeper, he told me I couldn't afford the steal. He said it was for serious people." The world record reveal wasn't just about the money. It was about the scale of the error. Rick looked at the computer monitor, seeing the $250,000 wire confirmation. It was one of the largest single-item, non-negotiated sales in the history of the shop. No haggling. "No, I gotta call a guy. Just a straight-up full-price acquisition of a museum-grade occult artifact. He's new, Rick lied quickly, gesturing toward a trembling Miller. He clearly doesn't know his history, musical or otherwise. Ozzy finally looked up, his purple lenses reflecting the bright overhead track lights. He handed the dagger to the man in the suit, who began to nestle it into a custom-molded foam insert within the metallic briefcase. History is a funny thing, Ozzy remarked, a glint of mischief returning to his expression. You think you're looking at the past, but the past is usually standing right in front of you, wearing an old coat. He turned to the crowd, giving a small two-fingered peace sign that sent the tourists into a frenzy of camera clicks. The Prince of Darkness hadn't just bought a dagger. He'd staged a masterclass in why you never judge a buyer by their cover. The heavy briefcase clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. The deal was done. In the history of the gold and silver pawn shop, thousands of people had walked through those doors hoping to strike it rich, but few had ever walked in and simply owned the room without saying more than a dozen words. Rick Harrison stood by the counter, his hands on his hips, watching as the security detail began to lead Ozzy toward the exit. He looked at Miller, who was still standing paralyzed behind the display case. The junior manager looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He had just cost the shop a massive potential for a recurring high-profile client, and worse. He had done it on camera in front of a dozen tourists with smartphones. "Rick," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. I thought he was just a you thought." Rick cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. "That's the problem. In this business, you don't think. You look at the item, and you look at the man. You treated a legend like a vagrant because he wasn't wearing a suit. Do you have any idea how many eccentric millionaires walk through Vegas in hoodies and flip-flops?" Out on the sidewalk, a matte black luxury SUV had pulled up to the curb, its engine purring with a low, expensive hum. The tourists spilled out of the shop onto the pavement, desperate for one last glimpse of the rock icon. Ozzy paused at the threshold, the desert heat hitting his face. He adjusted his round glasses and looked back at the shop's famous neon sign. "Wait," Miller called out, stumbling toward the door in a last-ditch effort at damage control. "Mr. Osborne, please. We have some vintage Gibson guitars in the back. 1958 originals. On the house for a private viewing? To make up for the inconvenience?" Ozzy stopped and turned slowly. He looked at Miller, then at the shop, and finally at the crowd of fans cheering his name. A small, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the look of a man who had spent 5 decades being the wild card in every room he entered. "I've got enough guitars, mate," Ozzy rasped, his voice carrying clearly over the Vegas traffic. "But you should keep that dragon wing, the $30 one. It suits you." A roar of laughter went up from the crowd. Miller withered, his face turning a shade of red that rivaled the rubies in the dagger he'd just sold. As the SUV door opened, Ozzy climbed inside, disappearing behind the dark tint of the windows. The motorcade pulled away, leaving the Pawn Stars crew standing on the sidewalk, staring at the space where a $250,000 deal had just walked out the door. The lesson was etched into the glass of the shop forever. Value isn't always polished, and power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it shuffles into your shop in a worn-out trench coat, asks a quiet question, and leaves you holding nothing but a plastic replica and a very expensive lesson in humility. The video ends with a slow pan across the empty vault display case, the velvet lining still bearing the faint indent of the ceremonial blade. "Never judge a book by its cover," the narrator concludes. "Because sometimes that book is a heavy metal epic,